Good morning. It's sort of I guess, a unique privilege and opportunity to come speak to an audience like this. I actually personally will admit that I am not a scientist and don't know a whole lot about science, and so I'm sort of the audience that would also be interested in learning more about how, I guess, you think of yourselves and your work and what type of role you see either the public or people who use social media or people in general sort of making better use of the information and the ideas and the thoughts that you guys generate and have. I think that there's a really interesting opportunity there to, I guess, build out conversations over time. And so what I figured I'd talk about today, and I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a second, is actually, I guess, presenting a few experiences that I've had using social media over time. So, I don't presume that any of you know who I am. I joined Google about 1.5 years ago. Prior to that, I worked for myself doing consulting in social media, working in design and open source communities. So I'm actually not an engineer. One of those few people at Google that sort of got through the door by pretending to be one on the internet, but they apparently didn't Google me. I've worked in sort of open distributed communities for quite a while. I helped start a community event model called Barcamp in 2005, and I've also worked on another project called Co-working about creating independent workspaces for mostly knowledge workers and independents and designers and so on. If you take a look at these things, you'll sort of like learn more about them, but these are some projects that I've been involved with that ultimately spread around the world, and that a lot of other people sort of picked up and carried forward, even after I'd moved on to sort of subsequent projects. And so I think that there are some lessons in those things, but what I actually want to talk about today are three things related to my past experience. So I'm going to talk about Spread Firefox, essentially the initial marketing of the Firefox web browser, hashtags, and this concept called generativity. So to begin with, the Spread Firefox project is sort of an interesting one. How many of you guys use Firefox today? Okay, that's pretty good. How about Chrome? Actually, I should ask that question. Okay. I'm not going to ask the other question because you need to switch. Safari's okay. It's built on WebKit, so that's cool, and that's open source. But so the Spread Firefox project actually sort of got an interesting start back in 2003, 2004. So I went to school in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, and I got a degree in design. And so I moved out to San Francisco after I graduated, and decided that I wanted to sort of get involved in something, to do something. And so at the time, I was reading these like Mozilla blogs because I was a web designer on the side, and Firefox is one of these few projects that actually was building a browser that got web standards and did web standards correctly, whereas the competition at the time did not. And so I was really excited that there'd actually be a browser that sort of moved the web forward and created this platform that people could build better and richer applications on. So this post was by this guy, Stephen Garrity, who runs a company in Canada called Silver Orange. And Silver Orange was doing a lot of web design for Mozilla at the time. And I was reading his blog because I was subscribed to his podcast. I read this post where he was calling out for designers, design volunteers basically, for this open source project. And it seemed, there was like no pay, bad hours, it was like, timelines were short, all the things that designers look for in a good project. And I was like, how could I resist this? This is like made for me. So I sent him an email and said, sure, sign me up. Like, I'm willing to help out. So we sort of like got this little cabal of people together, and we sort of like started brainstorming ideas and stuff like that. Now, the other thing that's sort of relevant to point out, this is sort of like what got me into working on the Mozilla project, but that back in like 2004, the aesthetic of Mozilla was one that was very community oriented. And so for some reason I couldn't help but be drawn to this aesthetic. It was sort of like putting a flag out there and saying, this is kind of what we're about. And, for what it's worth, of course, being an open source project, these guys were crazy about sharing their source code. And at the time it was crazy. And so, of course, you would think of them as being aligned with former fascist regimes. But the interesting thing is that, they sort of carried through this aesthetic over time, and they actually owned it. So even though there was like, a lot of people in the business world would like, call them communists and so on, they were like, well, hell yeah, like that's kind of what this is all about, right? I mean, this is their 1999 invite release party invitation or whatever. And, you can see sort of like the symbolism there very clearly depicting like, hey, this is who we are. And of course, on the other hand, Microsoft was sort of seen as the the alternative, and so it created this really interesting, I guess, tension. That people kind of like started to realize was like, actually this is something real. This is going on. Like there's this huge big company and they're making this product, and they've kind of like they've forgotten us. We are the web designers, and we are like the web developers, and we are creating the next generation web, and they basically make our lives a living hell. I don't know if any of you have done any like web design, but if you ever try to like test and build stuff for Internet Explorer 6, it's just a losing battle. In fact, I can probably say these things now, because even Microsoft says, stop using that browser. It's not a good browser. It's not the right product you should be using anymore. But what was interesting, at the time is that Firefox sort of tapped into that very sort of like, rich vein, I guess in a gold sense, where there was this pent-up angst, this desire for something better, this desire to move things forward. Microsoft and like Bill Gates had sort of said, the web's the future, the road ahead and all that. And then they kind of like forgot about it. And they were like, ActiveX, do that. And I think that left a lot of people feeling kind of like bummed that they dropped the ball. And so anyways, this sort of led to this great opportunity to create this tension between these two characters. So Mozilla was in effect kind of creating like the sports team for like the nerds on the web. It was like, this is the team that you wanted to rally behind. This was like, I don't know if it's, I come from New England, so maybe it's the Red Sox and the Yankees or something, but you finally had a team that sort of got you, that understood where you came from. As someone who used the web or, were in forums or using IRC and so on, like Mozilla was of that ilk and had that sort of genetic influence. And so people could relate to it. And it was a story that they felt really passionate about. Now, it's also worth pointing out that back in the day, there had been no commercial, like open source, I should say, no consumer open source successes really. Open source was really the realm of servers, of backend systems, Linux and the like. And so when you talk to people about open source, they're like, oh yeah, like that's the stuff that no one knows how to use. And they'd be right. So this idea that there was going to be this open source browser that, anybody beyond sort of like the geek kids would use was crazy. Not to mention the fact that they would ever finish it, because open source is never done. But even though people didn't really expect it to happen, in November 2004, Firefox 1.0, of course, was released. This is basically the post that sort of describes it. And even here, like coming out with this consumer release, they've got like the dirigible up in the left-hand corner and stuff. They hadn't really gotten the marketing thing down, and so or maybe they had, but it wasn't necessarily going to cross the chasm to the broader audience that needed to be reached in order for this thing to be a success, to basically reintroduce competition into the web marketplace. So part of my role in this, and part of the team that was created after that Stephen Garrity post, was essentially this group called Spread Firefox. And so we launched this site that basically looked like this, that was built upon an open source CMS called Drupal. And in fact, it was a very specific instance of Drupal, which was built on this software called CivicSpace. And CivicSpace came out of the Howard Dean presidential campaign. So the same software that was used to organize Howard Dean's unfortunately failed presidential campaign, which was, if you remember, was sort of like the precedent for Obama's campaign in terms of activating the grassroots, marketplace. We use the same software, the same ideas, the same techniques to market Firefox. And so you can start to see how like the shift around social media was happening in 2004, and that Mozilla's success in a large degree is because of their early recognition and adoption of the techniques of sort of community conversations. So if we actually look at the post that sort of launched Spread Firefox, I think there's some interesting things to pull out here, because these things can still be relevant today. If you were to launch something today and use these words, you might be able to at least start off in the right direction. So in this case, welcome to Spread Firefox. You are our marketing department. Like those words right there kind of like set the tone. It's like, we need you. We can't do this alone. And in fact, we're going to fail if you don't get involved. Yada, yada. We'll provide the tools, but you will drive campaigns that will be rolled out here over the coming months. So this is the convening place. This is where we want you to come back to learn about what each other is working on. We are going to create this environment, but it's up to you guys to actually, bring the party and bring the beer, if you know what I mean. It's going to be your music on the turntable. Spread Firefox will coordinate a series of volunteer efforts to promote Firefox, run campaigns to focus our community's energy on very tangible, specific goals. So these are also some important things. It was very specific. It was like, these are not going to be just sort of like abstract, like let's, convince the world of doing these things. There was plenty of those sort of like platitudes, but when it got down to it, the most successful campaigns were the ones that were time-bound, specific, concrete, that gave people something that they could do. We laid out a bunch of shovels and we said, we're going to dig a 4-foot hole, and then we did it. And then we celebrated it, and then we dug another hole over and over and over again until we got to China or something. And so the first campaign that we did was actually to get to 1 million downloads of the Firefox pre-release. So this is before the 1.0 even came out, and we wanted to do it in 10 days. So this wasn't like 2 months, this wasn't like a year, like 10 days, we get it done or we go home. And back in the day, I don't know if you guys have heard about this sort of like buzzword now about gamification, but we were doing it way back then, where you would get a point for everybody that downloaded Firefox from one of the links that you put on your blog or your site or your whereas site or your porn site or whatever. Turns out that porn sites were very good at promoting Firefox. Those little known facts. It's the whole, anyways. We heard about the stats in the last talk, right? So anyway, so we would basically acknowledge your contribution, as small as getting like even you or your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister to click on a link. You would get some recognition, and we would put you basically on the homepage of this site. And so now people had a way of being recognized for their contributions, and there was all sorts of gaming and spamming and all this other stuff that went on, but that meant that it was working. So it's also sort of important to keep that in mind, that this is like an organic system where we needed people to actually be involved. And so there had to be these abuses that would occur, and then we would just adjust like any organic system does. So the whole game here, in terms of like, getting the number of points and sort of getting up to the leaderboard and so on, was really predicated on the notion of just spreading this little button. And, it's a little hard to read, but it basically says take back the web. And so you would see these buttons pop up all over the place. And this is how we launched the campaign to basically take back the web with Firefox. We also did a number of other things, though, where we put out these different calls for volunteers. So we created lots of different ways for people to own parts of the project in a way that allowed for people with different skill sets to be involved. So it wasn't just, we want engineers, we want, marketers. It was like, whoever you are, if you can type and you have a browser, or even if you don't, we've got something for you. We will have a very small, very lightweight shovel, or a very, gold-plated heavy shovel, whatever it is. We want you to be involved. And so it was very important that we thought through all those different ways and the different people that would be coming to us to give them all something to do. In fact, we even had 8 different teams that were sort of mostly actually run by volunteers through the community, where they could self-identify, self-select, and find sort of their tribe that gave them something to do and some way to contribute. And so it was that personal hook that made this work relevant to them and made them keep coming back over and over again, because they now had a shared outcome or goal that gave them a reason to sort of hang out together. Like, this is one of the things that I think people don't often understand about Twitter. It's like, Twitter is full of dumb stuff because you don't know the people that you're, reading half the time. But if Twitter was full of all the people that you knew, the people that you did hang out with, your colleagues, or people that you admire or whatever, all of a sudden Twitter becomes much more relevant. And then it is relevant that so-and-so had, Cheerios for breakfast or whatever, if they're doing it wrong and tweeting about what they're having for breakfast. Because you're like, oh, hey, I saw you had Cheerios for breakfast. I did too. We have something in common, and I feel so much more connected to another human being. And that's basically how it works. I mean, that's the whole point of Twitter right there. It's like, so you don't feel as alone on the internet. Because, the internet's a very lonely place. All right. So anyway, so we had these different ways for people to get involved, all these different touch points, all these different like surface areas that would allow people to come and join us. And we sort of created this model where we wanted to be able to understand kind of like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but applied to like, spreading Firefox, where there were people who were like, oh, well, you don't have the browser. Well, first thing, you got to get the browser. So we'll give you the browser. And then the second thing is like, okay, well, we'll start getting you into our casual community where you start having problems and you start blaming Firefox for your computer crashing and, Excel doesn't launch and it doesn't add numbers correctly. And that's Firefox problem. So we start getting you into the community and the forums that way. And then once you're in there, you're like, oh, these people are kind of nice. Then we start moving you into deeper and deeper levels of commitment, possibly not unlike a church, but whatever. There's sort of a religious, vibe about this whole thing. But it was really thinking about those sort of expertise levels, right? Giving people like steps, like I don't know if you guys have ever played like, Mario Brothers, right? We'll go way back just to make sure. Sorry, that's not how I meant it. I just mean it's very general. That's way back. I mean, anyway, so the point is just about everybody, there are a few exceptions, but just about everybody can usually save the princess on the first level. I mean, that's usually. I mean, if you can pick up the controller and you sort of throw it around a little bit, you might be able to figure it out. And the reason is so that you want to go to the next level. It's not about the first level. It's not about how easy the first level is. It's about getting to the second level and then on and on and on. So in a similar way, we need to create those levels of engagement so that people didn't feel put off when they first got there. Like they have to like check out the kernel and like compile and all this stuff. It's like, it's not going to work. Sorry. And so another way to sort of like think about this is to think about sort of like an atom where you have these people who are sort of and by the way, again, I'm not a scientist and I studied this stuff in like 6th grade. So this is probably all wrong, but you have these like valence things, these orbits or whatever. I think those are the right words. And there's electrons and neutrons and, poles. Anyways, the point is at the outer layers, you have a very sort of weak attraction. These are the people that sort of like accidentally see a button and accidentally click it because they like went to close the browser and the button is like in the right place or whatever. That's like really, really weak. They'll probably just fly off and go to like some other atom somewhere else, like Glenn Beck's blog or something. However, as you move further and further in, you start to create like a stronger gravitational pull towards the center. And that's what you really want to be thinking about is how can you move those people who are outliers and who really don't care that much about whether you live or breathe to the inner layers where they start to care more and more and they become more activated. And then you sort of spin up your gravitational pull and you eventually go from an atom to a whole planet. I don't know how that stuff works. You guys can tell me later. But like you get the idea. So you're constantly pulling people into the center. And it's because you're involving them personally in the story. You're giving them something to do. In fact, one of the great things about the Firefox story, again, sort of this hero's journey thing, is that people could tell the story of Firefox to just about anybody. The grandkid could go and install it in their grandmother's computer, and the grandmother can now tell the story about how their grandkid installed this browser and it solved all of her computer problems. And that's a personal story that she can then tell someone else, or at Bridge. This worked for me, and I have a personal connection to how I got this thing, and it came through a trusted source, and so therefore you should do it too. And that's mostly how that word of mouth marketing kind of worked before there was Twitter, really, before there was Facebook and all this other stuff. If you look at the architecture of Spread Firefox, it was largely focused on what our volunteer contributors were doing. So these were their blogs. These were not Mozilla blogs. There might have been a few, maybe like a dozen or so Mozilla employee blogs. By the way, throughout this entire process, I was never employed by Mozilla. They were paying me for anything I did for them. I was just another volunteer like anybody else. And so the whole architecture of this is predicated on putting the community front and center and making them the heroes of the story. The more that Firefox succeeded, the more the community felt like they were making success together. And so it just, again, sort of created that snowball effect. Now, one of the things that was really important for us was, I mentioned sort of like the time-bound challenges that we had, the million downloads, 10 days, and so on. Well, whenever we would sort of, create the sort of thermostat of success to get people to do a certain activity, whenever we would hit that number, and we always did, I would go into Photoshop and create some sort of flaming fireball of awesome that the community would then sort of like take as a badge of honor that they had all collectively won. And then they would turn these things into essentially social objects that they would publish on their blogs or they would share out to their friends. When we hit 25 million downloads in under 100 days, I sort of like upped the flaming ante. And so this was the way that we celebrated to ourselves. We didn't really need anybody else to tell us we were doing well or not. We sort of had our own deadlines and our own goals and met them. And so, we also just, created these things that people could use to sort of like tell the story and share these concepts, and the community actually created a whole gallery full of these things, which is pretty awesome. So anyways, this all sort of culminated in this ad that I did that ended up in the New York Times that announced the launch of Firefox 1.0. And, again, it was sort of like there was a limited budget. We had a limited amount of time to get it done. A bunch of corporations were like, oh, we're going to like put in some money and make this happen. And we were like, well, we should probably, ask the community, if they want to like get involved or whatever. And so we basically had this 10-day campaign to raise, I think it was like $20,000 or something, Howard Dean style. And so we put this campaign out there, and in 10 days, we raised $250,000. And we're like, great, now what do we do? So, well, we went from a one-page ad to a two-page ad, as you can see here. And it also changed the way that I thought about the design of this ad, right? Like, the idea was just to tell the world, hey, Firefox is here, go download it. But it occurred to me, actually, the thing that we're launching is not so much the browser, because that's going to constantly change. We're launching this community. We're launching this team. Team Internet is here, bitches. And so if you actually look at the ad, I took the 10,000 donors and I put them in the ad, basically. And let me tell you, I was using a Power Mac G4 with like quad whatever nonsense, and I kept crashing Illustrator. The night before the ad launched, I had an Adobe technician call me on the phone, the guy who actually like wrote the text rendering engine for Illustrator, and was like, dude, what are you trying to do? Like, Illustrator does not do this. I'm like, it'll be done. So anyways, so we had like these 10,000 names, and this basically sort of like proclaimed to the world, like, this is what this is all about. Mozilla is not the product of one company. This is the product of 10,000 and hundreds of thousands of volunteers around the world. So y'all are on notice. And this has continued to this day. So, Firefox 4 came out in March. They basically did this sort of campaign around the world to like, have these Firefox parties. You could join a party with something as simple as a tweet. So again, sort of like those levels of engagement. And this time, within 2 days, they had like 16 million downloads. And you think about that, like 16 million people downloaded this browser. People never updated their browsers before. People still don't even know what browsers are, and yet they want Firefox, whatever that thing is. And now, 3 months later, they've hit 214 million downloads. Right? So if you can imagine one of your papers being downloaded 214 million times, it's aspirational, right? So, you think like, what is the equivalent of 214 million downloads in 3 months for like the climate change movement? I don't know what it is, but I hope you guys are thinking about it. So I'm going over, I'm going to speed up a little bit. So one of the things that was really interesting about this campaign that they did for launching Firefox was this little thing here, where you could basically add these 4 characters to your tweet, and you would join a party. This is what's called a hashtag. How many of you know what a hashtag is? Okay, so that's cool. So hashtags are sort of an interesting story because they came out of they're a reaction to a limitation of a medium where the medium itself was sort of like the art form. And I'm talking specifically, of course, about Twitter. So do you guys know what the first hashtag was? You want to see it? So this is the first hashtag that was used on Twitter. And the reason why I proposed this idea was because we are, the early adopters of Twitter wanted to be, like in every social medium that comes out, they wanted to be able to group together and have conversations about things. Well, Twitter didn't want to have groups. They didn't want to have those places for people to come together. It was just one continuous stream, which led people to be like, oh, it's like, so-and-so had Cheerios for breakfast. Who cares? Well, the Cheerio fan club people care, right? So it's like, how do they, meet each other? How do they find each other? And another problem that we had back in the day was that, AT&T just did not provide networking services, no matter how much you paid. And so you'd want to go check your tweets, or you'd want to contribute to a conversation, and the network would be down. The only thing that would get through, of course, were SMSs. And so if you think about what Twitter is and what blogging is, so if you go back and you look at Ev Williams' career, the guy that started Blogger and Twitter with some other people, Blogging is just email, but like with a to everyone, email address. And Twitter is just SMS, which is like a one-to-one communication channel, like to everyone. So we just like kept co-opting these, channels that were private before and making them public. That's all these things are. And then with Twitter, it was even dumber. He like took Blogger and he cut off the body of the post and was like, you don't need the body of the post. We'll just use titles. I mean, that's all it is, right? So anyway, so you can blog, by like sending an SMS, but yet then you can't sort of meet other people. And so we needed a system that would work over, a text-based, text-only medium, right? Like this is like whatever that like turn-based system, you've come to a dark end of the hallway, turn left, turn right, like that's what Twitter is. Anyways, it doesn't make any sense. So this is sort of like where it started. It was around, collating conversations around some topic or nugget or token or whatever. And the place where hashtags really took off in the beginning was, I don't know if you guys like saw this, but there was this huge like fire in San Diego in 2007. And so a friend of mine who lived in San Diego at the time, Nate Ritter, started tweeting, using Twitter as a broadcast channel. What he was doing was he was listening to like CB radios or like cop radios, fire radios, reading, blogs and news, TV stations, collating all this information, just constantly pushing a stream of information out there so that he was sort of like a source of information. He'd never done this before. He had no authority to do this, but he was the only one who was doing this when all these other media channels were sort of like providing conflicting information. And what he was doing was he was prefixing all of his posts with San space Diego space fire. And of course that's, perfectly logical if you want to read those posts, but if you want to search on them, it's not so great. And, I'd recently sort of proposed this hashtag idea. I was like, oh man, this could like be really good. So I went on to Flickr and I looked at their trending topics. And the folksonomic sort of representation of the San Diego fires happened to sort of come in a number of different forms. Santa Ana winds, Harris fire, San Diego fire, witch fire. Well, which of these is the most obvious to people who will read this and they're in Texas or they're in New Hampshire or wherever they are, and they will be able to get the context for this. So it's like, dude, just start using San Diego fire, all one word, put a hash in front of it, and you're done. And so that's what he did. And so he started doing this, over a period of days. The media sort of picked up this behavior, and, they kind of like ran with it and told that story. Now, Nate Ritter, of course, works in technology, so this was sort of okay for him to do. It wasn't like a big deal. But what was interesting about this was that it was a behavior that was very easy to imitate. So his followers or other people's followers could sort of see his tweets coming out in some other context and be like, oh, I see what you did there. And I could do that too. And so they started doing that. In rapid fashion. And so now, of course, if you go to Twitter and you go to like Twitter search, one of the things that you can do, as you see their trending topics there now include hashtags, which at one point they filtered out entirely. You could do a search for like hash climate change, and you can basically find all the people having conversations about this stuff. And now Twitter is aggregating video, and if there were photos that were tagged with the stuff, you could see that. So it starts to create this sort of channel of information that people can very easily contribute to very quickly, very low bar. And I don't know if there was a story about hashtags in the Sunday's fashion section of all places, about how hashtags are starting to like break out into other mediums because they're so simple. I mean, this is like the stupidest hack ever, and yet it worked because you can use them when you're drunk. I mean, that's like the touchstone of like social software that works. Is that how we test new ideas? Yes, that's. I mean, that usually it takes a couple, bottles of beer, and I can figure out, yeah, that's going to work, or I have no idea. I prefer to avoid Red Bull because that'll give you cancer. I don't know that. That's totally unconfirmed, and I'm not a scientist. Anyway, so, you've seen like how hashtags have been used more recently because people were able to figure this stuff out, right? So, whether it was like the Iran election and all the protests that have been going on in like the Middle East, or what happened in Egypt, with this hashtag. I mean, these very, very simple concepts were able to spread mimetically because people could sort of mimic them. They were obvious. They were, and they also created sort of a common like communication currency that people could sort of spread amongst themselves. So how does this all come together? Well, I think one way to sort of think about this and to think maybe differently about social media, because it's less to me in my mind about the huge numbers. I mean, you're like, if I could give a presentation on like the numbers of people on planet Earth, and you'd probably be like, if I were choosing a planet to live on, planet Earth would probably be better than, say, Mars. you know? And you'd be like, well, that's where I want to have my social media campaign. Of course, you know, or like, that's where I want to get my oxygen because they have the most of it or something. It's not so much about the numbers, I think. It's more about how these communication channels have wide distribution and availability and very easy availability to lots of different people who are going to use these things for lots of different purposes. And then therefore you can sort of join those things and do whatever you do already. And then people will sort of like follow that and they'll internalize what you're doing, and if it's interesting to them, then they might actually get involved if you leave those surface areas out there for people to sort of jump in, you know, and spread a hashtag or whatever. And so a way to think about this is basically what Jonathan Zittrain talks about in his book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. Have you guys read this book? No? Okay, well, if you haven't, I recommend that you steal it from his website because he's a communist and he is giving it away under Creative Commons license. Just kidding, he's not a communist. But you can download it. And he calls out these 5 principles. The first one is how extensively a system or technology leverages a set of possible tasks. So basically, how dexterous is this thing? Like, again, hashtags were stupid. That's why they were useful. You could apply them to just about anything. Any channel that supported text, you know, you can use hash. So I've started putting hashtags in like the subjects of my emails, you know, because I'm weird like that. And again, like, you know, how well can this also be adapted to like a range of different tasks? How easily can new contributors master it? It's pretty easy to master hashtags, just like Super Mario Brothers. How accessible is it to those ready and able to build on it? So people are just sort of like waiting for a solution. There were all these people on Twitter waiting to get together to have some sort of group solution. And this was the easiest possible thing that they could do to sort of solve that one problem. And then how transferable are any changes made to that system to others? You know, including and perhaps especially for non-experts. So, you know, with like the Spread Firefox campaign, it was like, if you can write a little HTML, you can join the movement. You can move, you know, do something. If you don't know HTML, you can't write HTML. Look, just click on the button a bunch of times and download it. You know, that'll help our numbers, that kind of thing. So, you know, you go from like something like this, which is very simple, you know, and Mozilla is continuing this today, and I encourage you to look at their Drumbeat project. Because they're taking some of these ideas and trying to help move the things, their efforts forward to keep the web open and free. And you think about how this creates, again, kind of like Mozilla is like putting out these flags for like Team Internet. You know, come join us, come help us out. We've got a bunch of work to be done, and this is the place where you should go for that. 2 other types of efforts that are really about inclusivity. Yeah. Anyways, participation. Giving people a story that they can own, that they can retell over and over again, a very lightweight way of actually getting involved in all the things that are asking for their attention, to the point where finally you sort of, you know, show back to them the power of their engagement as a whole. You know, what is the sum total of your participation, so that you feel like you made an individual dent, you know, in the universe, as whoever it is that said that, and that they're part of something bigger and more interesting than they could have been otherwise. I mean, this is the draw of social media. Again, it's so that you don't feel so lonely on the web, and that when you're not feeling so lonely, it's because you're connecting to a bunch of other people in really interesting, meaningful, and important ways. So anyways, I'm over, but that's all I got today. Thank you.
Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions, and we will also both be here for the rest of the afternoon.
Yeah.
Questions?
It's probably the question. How do you kind of separate your personal life from your professional life? I started trying to do this on Facebook to spread some of the stuff I do in my lab, and as soon as I got overwhelmed from classes from high school to start posting pictures of me when I was 19 years old. And how do you put like a fake web page to lure them in and then do another one?
So, I mean, maybe both the crass and the right answer is you don't. I used to go by this username, this sort of moniker, Factory Joe, on the web. I had factoryjoe.com. I was Factory Joe on Twitter, and I ended up speaking at conferences, and people would come up to me at the end, and they'd be like, Joe, that was a great talk, and I'd be like, that's not my name. So what ended up happening, from like 2004 to like 2008, is that ability to like keep everything separate sort of went away. And in fact, one of the ways in which you derive your authority is by owning like your identity, both offline and online. And so if you understand that social media is a way of continuing to develop like both your personal brand and the work that you do, and it's an amplifier for the things that you're already passionate in, then I think that that's actually a much more effective way to do it. Now, in terms of like dealing with like, the kindergarten friends and all that stuff, that's sort of an unsolved problem that I hope gets better over time. But I do think that there are different mediums that are better suited for certain types of interactions. So I tend to be, pretty careful about how I use Facebook. I mean, you can use like Facebook pages or things like that, but you kind of have to be really dedicated to that. And unless like that is like a sort of full-time job, it becomes hard to maintain. So I find that I use Twitter mostly to sort of like talk about all sorts of random stuff that people in my field might be interested in. And like Facebook's like something I use personally. I don't think of it as like being like a very like private channel, but I also don't engage in it in a way that I do on Twitter. So they're just different mediums for different things. It's like you watch MTV for one thing and you watch the Discovery Channel for something else.
There are settings that you can have on your Facebook page where everybody doesn't see all of this stuff. But it's true. I kind of cringe when somebody posts something that's a friend of mine and it's, I'm going out to the grocery store now. I don't care. Why are you doing this on my Facebook page? But there are also fan pages, and those are not as interactive. But that's a way you can.
Yeah, I mean they can be. I think part of the challenge is it's more about your behavior and adopting techniques that are natural to you. Right, like it would be sort of unnatural for me to actually use a fan page too often. So it's better for me to use the mediums that I already feel comfortable posting to, whether that's my blog or whether that's Twitter. So I think it's also about just effort.
Jay?
So I don't use, we have a communications team at Pew, and I do some blogs that they post and something. They have Facebook page and all that. I don't do the stuff, and that's why I'm glad I'm here. But one of the things that we face in our area is that we work on a contentious topic, and social, I've heard people who say, I heard a radio show recently in D.C., a local radio show about how this parenting listserv just people get nasty and call each other names. What we would really like to do, I think, taking cues from Ed Babak's work, is sort of have a constructive engagement with this 75% of the population that is reachable and curious on climate change. And there's this 10% of the population that wants to actively undermine that effort. Can they just make it impossible for us to succeed with social networking to be?
Do you want to say that?
You can tell. You can.
We had this problem with Mozilla too, right? And so part of it was we embraced the communist sort of visuals, and that became something that they couldn't use against us anymore. So we sort of turned that around. That obviously doesn't work in all cases, but I think that there's a way to think about this where there's your sort of space which you curate and which you're in charge of the house rules versus going over to perhaps a more public forum or a place where you don't control the rules, where that type of behavior is sort of what's encouraged or desired, right? So it's I don't know if you've played any first person shooters, but the goal is to kill your opponent. And so if you took that part out of the game, it wouldn't be interesting to the people who are there. So if you create an alternative version or an alternative place to have these conversations, you might have an open door policy, but you have very clear guidelines. I think a good example of this is probably Stack Overflow, which is mostly targeted at developers who have questions about coding. And what they've done is they sort of put up this wall of text before you sign up that basically says, look, if you're going to come into our place, these are the house rules, and we reserve the right to basically kick you out, silence you, or we'll have a troll filter where you can keep posting your vitriol, but no one else will see it. So, have at it. But it's not going to be that much fun for you because you're not going to get the responses that you're looking for. And I think it's probably more important to do experiments because you still want people to be engaged. You just want people to, over time, to sort of lose their momentum in making perhaps claims that just don't have any basis. Or what we've also done in another community that I've been involved with called Microformats is that we actually sort of adopt a version of the scientific method where we have everyone do certain types of homework before making claims. And so we've built a culture that actually requires people to go out, and then we spread that culture so that everyone who joins is basically hazed, if you will. They have to sort of understand, look, if you're going to make some proposal here, you've got to basically not welcome here boundaries.
by the idea in the open source movement that you have authority, like we have in the science community, the IPCC, and major journals and universities, but you also have open source. Talk a little bit about how you balance letting all these people in, feeling like they are part of your efforts, with maintaining a good Firefox interface.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand about open source, and I think I didn't either, is that open source is not like a free-for-all. It doesn't mean that everyone who sort of contributes to it has their changes, made to the core product. So the way that open source works is that there is typically a benevolent dictator of some sort that has some sort of clear vision, and that clear vision actually has to be made like very explicit, crystal clear, and that person's job is basically to repeat that stuff over and over and over and over and over. You get the point, right? Again. And they are sort of like, again, the ones who like have the flag and kind of like lead it forward, but they allow other people to like pick up pieces of that and move it forward as well. And then when they contribute and their patches or contributions are accepted, then that's sort of the way that you win at the game of open source. So it's not that all these different patches and contributions make their way into and change the fundamental product, but that you leave the door open for those types of contributions. The second thing that's really important, and I was going to talk about GitHub, but I didn't have time, is that GitHub is sort of this developer community site that's sprung up, that sort of trailed in the footsteps, I guess, of Google Code and SourceForge. So it's basically the community place where developers will share a lot of their source code. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about GitHub is that they made one very important change to the open source culture, which is that they took the act of forking, which is basically taking a project source code and creating a copy of it and then working on it on your own as your own version of the thing, which used to be kind of like a big FU, like, I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to go take your stuff and do my own version of it, to an act of love. So if I fork your project, it's because I think it's actually pretty good, and I want to actually make my own sort of, contributions to that. And what ends up happening is that those people who do that, it's very hard for them actually to build up both community credibility as well as to overtake the original project unless the original maintainer kind of like falls off the face of the earth, right? So the original project kind of still maintains all the momentum and all the community interest, but there can be a fork or many or thousands of forks that are all different sort of variations of the same theme. And that actually allows for the distribution of work over time and over lots of different people that then actually ends up leading people to contribute their stuff back because it's too much work to maintain these branches. So the point is that you're sort of allowing people to fork off your ideas or the expression of a certain truth. You allow them to sort of experiment. Perhaps they'll gain some traction in some way, but that you're still the bearer of a certain truth which you maintain over time. So it's the consistency and it's the dedication and the passion for that original, I guess, expression of the idea or concept that people are drawn to. It's not just the idea itself. So I think that it's sort of okay, again, as an experiment. I'm not saying this is like going to work in every context, but to allow forks of ideas and see what actually happens. And then if people want to actually contribute back, then you provide the means to do so. It's when you cut off the ability for people to contribute in meaningful ways that I think you end up with kind of like these very destructive behaviors because they're the only expression that people can actually use to get attention.
Quick comment, just to follow up. I think another option, rather than have maybe strict guidelines on contributions to sort of deal with the people that are extremely critical, but I think filling up what the congressman said, there's a way to respond with gentleness and politeness that's unexpected, and it has a way of diffusing that because they're really looking for a fight.
Yeah.
The other thing, I guess, on the hashtags, I'm just curious if you could comment. They're obviously being used as ways to collect ideas, but they're also used ways to emphasize sort of one-off use of hashtags, like "Can't believe I'm seeing this" or something.
Yep.
I just wondered where you see that going.
Sure. So on your first point about the sort of like gentle rebuke, I think it's always important, again, sort of with community guidelines, and these are less sort of restrictions on what you can and can't post. Usually it's not meant to be like draconian. If you want to look at a good set of like community guidelines, Flickrs are pretty good. It's more about sort of having that back channel and saying, look, that really wasn't cool, And, you know, if you keep that up, like, we're going to have to sort of like silence your account for a little bit or something. But you basically have like a de-escalation approach as opposed to sort of like hashing it out publicly in the comments. So I think that's a very good point. With regards to the kind of almost like poll-based way that people are using hashtags today, I think it's more a testament to like the dexterity of the form than it is about any particular thing. I mean, it's interesting and it's fun. And again, it's like these sort of like bandwagon things where people can jump on a topic. Like, I think, what was it? It's like, you know, funny movie endings or strange movie, I don't know, whatever it was, like, where, and I think this is also a good example of the way that hashtags work from a folksonomic perspective, where they might actually gather some steam, but then completely dissipate. And then maybe they'll come back a couple months later, or maybe not. The whole notion is that instead of having this sort of like top-down group architecture, you allow these things to sort of blossom where they will and then die. And so you're actually introducing the notion of decay into social media, and that's just part of it. If your hashtag doesn't take off today, keep doing it for another 2 weeks and see where it goes. And if it doesn't work, try something else.
We have to end it now, but we'll both be here and really appreciate your attention, and we've got a lot of work to do.